James and Tudep were living what many would call a dream life. Their love had grown through every obstacle, and James's company was flourishing, standing strong in a highly competitive market. Every morning felt like a new victory, and beside them, Tran, their trusted secretary, was always there. Tran was intelligent, graceful, and deeply respected by everyone in the company. Her calm presence and efficiency had earned her a special place in their lives. No one could have imagined that behind that gentle smile and professional demeanor was a heart weighed down by a secret so heavy it could shatter everything. Tran had been silently in love with James for a long time. She never said a word, never crossed a line, but she watched him closely. She celebrated his achievements from afar and smiled through the ache of knowing he belonged to someone else. That silent love turned into a quiet darkness, slowly growing inside her until it pushed her to make choices she never would have imagined herself making. Despite all her outward perfection, inside she was falling apart. Her feelings made her vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, she became a tool, used by someone even darker. The company began to suffer in strange and unexpected ways. Important documents were leaking. Deals were collapsing without warning. James was confused, feeling like some invisible force was tearing down everything he had built. Tudep, with her sharp instincts, noticed the subtle changes too. She quietly began to investigate, watching people more closely, checking records and files. One by one, the pieces came together. Documents that didn't belong, camera footage that seemed too blurry, but just clear enough to reveal something chilling. Someone was coming into the office late at night. Someone they trusted. The evidence pointed in one direction: Tran. The kind, smiling woman who greeted them every morning had betrayed them. In a tense, heart-wrenching confrontation, Tran broke down and admitted everything. Her unrequited love had made her an easy target for manipulation. And the person pulling the strings? Mr. Joan, James's longtime enemy, the shadow who had tried to bring ruin to his family for years. But the revelation that truly broke their hearts was that Mr. Joan was not just an enemy. He was Tran's father. He had used his own daughter's pain and longing to orchestrate a betrayal so deep it tore through the very soul of the company and their family. James and Tudep were left reeling. They felt not just betrayed as professionals, but wounded as people. They had trusted Tran, cared for her, treated her like family. Now that trust was shattered. But within that pain, a new strength began to rise. They knew they couldn't let this break them. They had to fight, not just against Joan, but against the pain and sadness that tried to pull them under. They had to rise above the betrayal, and they had to do it together. As they tried to heal from Tran's betrayal, they thought the worst was behind them. But fate had more to reveal. Among the documents Tran left behind were files filled with information that stunned James to his core. Hidden among the papers were secrets about his own father, his hero, the man he had looked up to all his life. The truth felt like a dagger. James's father hadn't just been a competitor of Joan, he had once been his partner. They had worked together on illegal deals, laundering money, and using shady business practices to build the empire James now ran. James couldn't believe it. The man who had taught him everything about honesty, about leadership, about family pride, had hidden this dark past. The pain of that realization was overwhelming. When James confronted his father, the conversation was cold and painful. His father didn't deny it. Instead, he warned James, if he exposed the truth, it would destroy not just their family name, but countless lives built around the company. He asked James to stay silent, to protect the legacy. James stood there, torn between duty and truth. But deep in his soul, he knew silence would make him a prisoner of lies. Tudep stood beside him, unwavering. Her hand in his, she whispered the words that gave him the courage to move forward. If we don't face the darkness will devour us all. That moment lit a fire in James. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't let fear silence him. He would speak the truth, no matter the cost. With that resolve, James began gathering evidence, calling in lawyers, building a case. He worked quietly but fiercely, ready to expose everything. The days were heavy, full of pressure and fear. But Tudep never left his side. She was his strength, his clarity, his hope. As the moment of truth approached, they were ready, not just to reveal the past, but to embrace the future they believed in. A future built on truth, not secrets. A love tested by fire but unbroken. Tension filled every corner of their lives as James prepared to reveal the darkest truths about his family, about Tran's betrayal, and about the man behind it all, Mr. Joan. But just when it seemed like they were nearing the final steps of exposing everything, something even more devastating happened. Mr. Jones, cold and calculating, launched a final attack not on James's business, but on his heart. He went after Tudep's adoptive mother, the only mother figure Tudep had ever truly known, the woman who had stood by her, loved her when her own blood had abandoned her, and who had become her greatest source of strength. Tudep's adoptive mother was the light in her life, a woman who never asked for anything, but gave everything. She had raised Tudep with fierce love, guided her through the darkest times, and helped her become the strong, loving woman who now stood beside James. Mr. Jones knew this. He knew that striking here would shatter their spirits. So he kidnapped her, using her as a pawn to try and silence James and Tudep before they could go public with the truth. It was a direct, cruel blow to their hearts. When Tudep found out, her world collapsed. Her screams filled the house, and her tears felt endless. She couldn't breathe. It was as if the ground beneath her had vanished. But even in that storm of fear and pain, James held her tightly and whispered with quiet determination, "We will find her. I promise you." There was no time to waste. James contacted his private security team and all his trusted allies. The city became a map of desperate hope. Every second that passed felt like it could be the last. Leads were scarce. Hints pointed to the outskirts of the city, to a warehouse abandoned for years, a place cold, forgotten, and filled with shadows. That night, with the air thick and heavy, James and his team surrounded the warehouse. The silence was terrifying. Inside, they moved quickly and precisely. And then, in a corner of that dark place, they found her. Tudep's mother was weak, bruised, but alive. Her eyes met James's, and despite her pain, they sparkled with tears of gratitude. She reached out to him like a mother to a son, and James embraced her, overwhelmed with relief. Tudep rushed in moments later, collapsing into her mother's arms, sobbing like a child. The three of them stayed there for a moment, surrounded by the cold walls of the warehouse, yet warmed by love that refused to break. The very next day, with courage burning in his chest, James stood in front of the press. Cameras flashed, microphones waited, and the world held its breath. He told everything. About Tran's betrayal, about Mr. Jones' manipulation, and most painfully, about his own father's crimes. His voice didn't tremble. He had made peace with the storm inside him. He knew he would lose business partners. He knew his family name might fall. But what he gained was something greater, truth. And truth, no matter how painful, set him free. By his side, Tudep stood like a warrior, no longer just the woman who loved him, but his equal, his anchor, his pride. Her eyes were filled with tears, not of fear, but of strength. She held his hand in front of the whole world, showing everyone that even when everything is ripped away, love can still stand tall. The storm did not break them. It revealed who they truly were. The business world reeled. Some people turned their backs. Others reached out in admiration. James had not just exposed corruption, he had shown courage, a rare honesty in a world used to hiding sins behind power. And he did not do it alone. He did it with Tudep, with the mother they had saved, with every scar and every tear turned into strength. Together they walked forward, not as victims but as survivors, not as broken souls but as shining lights. They knew the battle wasn't truly over. There would always be shadows, but they had already won the most important fight, the fight to keep their souls untainted, their love unshaken, and their truth alive. Even after the public revelation, the emotional storm had not passed. The days that followed were filled with painful consequences. Calls that once came in full of respect were now laced with hesitation or silence. Business partners withdrew. Old friends disappeared into the shadows. The empire James had worked so hard to build trembled under the weight of truth. But James did not regret speaking out. He walked through the ruins of his reputation with his head held high. What mattered now was not what people thought of him, but what kind of man he chose to be when everything was at stake. Tudep never left his side. She had always known James as a strong man, but now she saw something even deeper, his ability to choose integrity over image, to face his family's past with raw courage. She stayed with him during long, sleepless nights when James would sit quietly, looking out the window, replaying the betrayal of his father, of Tran, of everyone he once believed in. Sometimes he cried silently, sometimes he just held Tudep's hand without saying a word. And she understood. She didn't try to fix the silence. She just remained there, steady and loving, reminding him he was not alone. Mr. Jones, however, was not finished. His defeat only made him more dangerous. The kidnapping had failed, but his fury had grown. He still held power, influence, and connections that stretched far beyond what anyone could imagine. The public had seen his name exposed, but the man himself had not been touched. He began orchestrating a quiet counterattack, spreading misinformation, attempting to manipulate media, using hidden hands in law enforcement and business to make James's life more difficult. He wanted to destroy James not just as a businessman, but as a man, to break him emotionally and financially. But what Mr. Jones hadn't expected was James's growing support from the public, people who had once known pain, betrayal, and injustice themselves. They saw their own struggles in James's courage. Letters began arriving at his office from strangers. People wrote about their own stories, their own broken families, their own triumphs. And something incredible began to happen. The same truth that had shaken James's world was now helping others heal theirs. Meanwhile, Tran, once the perfect secretary, now the betrayed daughter and the unwilling pawn, was imprisoned. But even there, the weight of her choices crushed her spirit. She wrote a letter to James and Tudep, a long and painful confession. In it, she admitted that everything she had done had come from a place of twisted love and fear. She told them how her father had manipulated her emotions, used her loneliness, and turned her against the only people who ever truly saw her. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply said she was sorry and that she hoped they would find peace. Reading the letter, Tudep felt a quiet ache in her heart. Despite everything, she could not hate Tran. She saw a woman broken by love, by loyalty, and by a father who used her as a weapon. James said nothing for a long time after reading it. Finally, he whispered, "We cannot undo what she did. But maybe this pain will teach us all something." He didn't forgive easily, but he didn't hold on to hatred either. It was not who he wanted to become. With renewed strength, James and Tudep returned to rebuilding, not just their company, but their lives. They started small, meeting with new partners, reaching out to those who still believed in honesty. Slowly, a new foundation began to rise. It wasn't as flashy or powerful as before, but it was real, and it was theirs. Every contract signed was honest. Every step forward came from truth. And through it all, Tudep was there, his partner in business, in life, in love. They also made time to rest, to breathe. They would go on quiet walks, sit under the stars, talk about their dreams. They learned to find peace in the little moments, watching the sun rise from their balcony, cooking dinner together, laughing over small things. The chaos around them had tried to break them, but it had only made their bond stronger. What they had now wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was enough. James no longer feared the past. He had faced it. Tudep no longer feared losing what she loved, because she had already walked through that fire and survived. Together, they had faced betrayal, grief, corruption, and danger. And they had not only survived, they had grown. The wounds were still there, but so was the healing. They had chosen love over vengeance, truth over silence, and light over darkness. And though the world might change again, though more trials might come, they were ready. Because they knew who they were. They knew what they had. And as long as they had each other, they had everything. Even as life seemed to return to a fragile balance, the shadows of the past continued to linger. James and Tudep tried to move forward, building something honest from the ruins left behind. But peace, they learned, was not a destination. It was something they had to fight for every single day. Mr. Jones, though momentarily silent, had not vanished. His power was fading, but his hatred was still burning. He had lost the battle for the company, for Tran, and for public image. But there was one thing he hadn't lost, his ability to hurt. And now, he turned his attention to one final act of vengeance, shattering James and Tudep from within. It started subtly. Anonymous messages, rumors in the media, small scandals connected to James's name that hadn't even happened. One article claimed James had forged documents, another accused Tudep of embezzlement. These lies weren't meant to destroy legally. They were designed to isolate them, to make everyone doubt them again. Business partners who had just begun trusting James pulled away. Investors froze deals. People who once supported them now hesitated again, unsure of what was real. But James didn't fall this time. He didn't run. He faced the rumors head-on. With Tudep beside him, they held press conferences, showed documents, told the truth again and again. They stood in front of the world not as victims, but as people who had nothing to hide. The media slowly shifted. The public began to question who was behind these lies, and many started to suspect that Mr. Jones' reach hadn't truly ended. But the worst came one rainy evening when James received an unmarked envelope. Inside were photographs, old, blurry, and threatening. They showed his late mother, smiling, innocent, and beside her, a man James never wanted to see again, Mr. Jones. The note attached simply read, "Your family's lies go back further than you think." That night, James didn't speak much. He sat in silence, staring at the photos, wondering what kind of life his mother had really lived, what secrets had been buried with her. Tudep, sensing his pain, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and rested her head on his chest. "You don't have to carry it all alone," she whispered. And for the first time, James let the tears fall, not just for his mother, but for the decades of deception, for the truth he might never fully uncover, and for the ache of never truly knowing who his family had been. But still, even in his grief, he found clarity. He could not allow the past to define his future. He could not let Mr. Jones win by making him afraid of his own legacy. So James made a final decision. He would visit Tran in prison. It was not easy. The moment he saw her, pale and thinner than before, his heart tightened. Tran looked down, unable to meet his gaze. For a long time, neither of them said a word. Then James finally asked, "Did you know? About my mother and your father?" Tran's voice shook as she answered, "I suspected, but I didn't have proof. He used to speak of her with bitterness and regret. I think he loved her once. And when she chose your father over him, something in him broke." That answer haunted James more than he expected. So much of his life had been shaped by decisions made long before he was born. And yet, here he was paying for them. He looked at Tran, the woman who had once been a friend, then an enemy, and now, something in between. "You don't have to keep being his weapon," he said gently. "You can choose something different." Tran nodded slowly, tears falling down her face. "I already did when I wrote you that letter. I chose to stop running." As he left the prison, James didn't feel closure, but he felt lighter. He had spoken the truth. He had faced the pain. And now, it was time to truly move on. Back home, Tudep had been organizing a quiet celebration. Not for success in business, but for survival. For strength. For the fact that, through everything, they were still together. Their small house was filled with flowers, candles, and soft music. Friends who hadn't abandoned them came to share smiles, hugs, and laughter. That night, James and Tudep stood outside, looking at the stars. "You know," she said softly, "we could disappear. Leave it all. Start fresh somewhere no one knows our names." James smiled. "We could, but I think we were meant to be here. To build something better. Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been betrayed, hurt, silenced." She leaned into him. "Then we'll stay. And build. And love. No matter what comes next." And so, in a world that had tried to break them again and again, James and Tudep remained, hand in hand, eyes toward the future. They had lost everything once. But now, they had rebuilt something unshakable. Not a company, not a legacy, but truth, loyalty, and love. And that was more than enough. As time passed, the chaos began to settle like dust after a storm. James and Tudep slowly returned to a life of peace, not because the world had become kinder, but because they had grown stronger. The wounds of betrayal, lies, and heartbreak had not vanished, but they had learned to live with them, not as scars to hide, but as proof of survival. Their company, once on the verge of collapse, began to rise again, not with greed or power, but with integrity. Investors who had once turned their backs returned, not for profit, but because they now believed in the people behind the business. James became known not just as a CEO, but as a man who dared to tell the truth, even when it meant risking everything. Tudep, once just the quiet strength beside him, had become a voice of her own, a symbol of grace, wisdom, and unshakable loyalty. Mr. Jones, now stripped of power and influence, faded into silence. His final attempts to break them had failed. His greatest weapon, secrets and manipulation, had lost its power because James and Tudep had chosen truth over silence, love over fear. In the final days of summer, James and Tudep stood on the rooftop of their home, watching the sun set over the city. The air was warm, the light golden. It was not a dramatic ending, but a peaceful one. The kind that comes after years of storm. James turned to Tudep and said, "We didn't just survive, we lived. We loved, and we kept our souls intact." Tudep smiled, her eyes full of tears and peace. "And that," she whispered, "is the greatest victory." Their journey was not about winning or losing. It was about holding on to what mattered when everything else tried to pull them apart. It was about standing side by side, even when the world fell to pieces. And now, having weathered the worst, they faced the future with open hearts, knowing they could endure anything, as long as they had each other. Dear viewers, thank you for walking through this emotional journey with James and Tudep. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest times, love, truth, and courage will always find a way to shine. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything and helps us continue bringing you stories of strength, love, and hope. Until next time, take care and never stop believing in the power of truth and love.